What if a city could change the way you think, slowly, quietly, without you even noticing? In Gotham City, people don't just face danger, they begin to see the world differently, feel differently, and sometimes become someone entirely new. But why does this keep happening? Is it the darkness of the streets, the broken systems, or something deeper hidden within the mind itself? As we explore the lives shaped by Gotham, from order to chaos, from control to collapse, a question begins to grow. Does the city create madness, or does it reveal what was already there? The city that breathes in shadows. There are cities that feel alive in simple ways, where people move through streets and lights flicker on at night, and everything seems to follow a pattern that is easy to understand. But there are also places that feel alive in a deeper and quieter sense, where the air itself seems to carry memory, where the buildings hold something unspoken, and where even silence can feel heavy. And Gotham City belongs to that second kind, not because it moves or changes like a living creature in any obvious way, but because it creates a feeling that stays with anyone who steps into it. A feeling that something is always watching, always waiting, always present just beneath the surface. At first glance, Gotham can appear like any other large city, with tall structures rising close together, narrow streets weaving between them, and a skyline that stretches across the horizon. Yet when you look a little longer, when you allow your eyes to settle and your thoughts to slow, you begin to notice how everything feels slightly different, as if the city is not simply a place where people live, but a space that quietly shapes the way they think and feel, guiding them in ways that are not loud or forceful, but steady and constant. The buildings themselves seem to carry weight, not only because of their size, but because of what they represent, layers of time stacked one upon another, each year leaving behind something that does not fully disappear. And as new walls are built and old ones are covered, the past remains hidden beneath the surface, creating an atmosphere that feels thick and full, as if every corner holds a story that has not yet been told, and every shadow hides something that refuses to fade. There is a stillness in Gotham that can feel almost peaceful at first, especially in the quiet hours when the streets are empty and the noise fades into the distance. But this stillness is not the kind that brings comfort, because it carries a sense of pause rather than rest, like a breath that has been held for too long, waiting for something to happen, something that has happened many times before and will likely happen again, even if no one can say exactly when or how. Light in Gotham behaves differently as well, not because it is weaker, but because it rarely fills the space completely, leaving edges untouched and corners dim, so that even in places that should feel bright, there is always a sense that darkness is nearby, not pushing forward, but never fully retreating. And this balance between light and shadow creates a constant tension that people may not always notice, but still carry with them as they move through their daily lives. When someone walks through Gotham for the first time, they might not be able to explain why they feel uneasy, why their steps become slower, or why they begin to look around more often. But the feeling is there, quiet and persistent. And over time, that feeling can begin to change the way they see things, shaping their thoughts in small ways that build gradually until the difference becomes part of who they are, without them even realizing it. It is not that Gotham forces anything upon the people who live within it, because there is no single moment where a person can point and say that the city made them feel or act a certain way, but rather that it surrounds them with an environment that encourages certain responses, that makes certain choices feel more natural than others, and that slowly guides them toward paths that might not have seemed possible in a different place. The streets themselves seem to hold a kind of quiet rhythm, not one that can be heard with the ears, but one that can be felt in the way everything moves, from the distant hum of traffic to the echo of footsteps against concrete. And even in moments when nothing appears to be happening, there is a sense that something is always in motion beneath the surface, something that connects every part of the city in ways that are difficult to see but impossible to ignore. There are places in Gotham where the air feels heavier than usual, where conversations become softer without anyone deciding to lower their voice, and where even simple actions seem to carry more weight than they should. And these places are not marked on any map, because they are not defined by location, but by the feeling they create, a shared understanding that something about them is different, something that makes people pause, even if only for a moment. As time passes, the people who live in Gotham begin to adapt to these conditions, not by resisting them, but by accepting them as part of their reality. And this adaptation can take many forms, some becoming more cautious, others more watchful, and some even finding ways to embrace the tension, turning it into something that gives them purpose, something that allows them to feel in control within a place that rarely offers certainty. What makes Gotham especially unique is not just the presence of darkness, but the way it coexists with everything else, never fully taking over, but never disappearing either, creating a balance that feels unstable yet constant. And within this balance, people are left to navigate their own thoughts and emotions, often without clear guidance, often without the kind of support that might exist elsewhere. And this can lead to choices that feel logical in the moment, even if they seem difficult to understand from the outside. There is also a quiet pressure that builds over time, one that does not come from any single source, but from the accumulation of small experiences, small fears, small uncertainties, all gathering slowly until they form something larger, something that begins to influence how a person reacts to the world around them, shaping not only their actions, but their sense of identity, their understanding of who they are and what they must become in order to survive. In this way, Gotham becomes more than just a setting, because it does not simply exist in the background while events unfold, but instead plays a role in shaping those events, not through direct action, but through influence, through the quiet and steady presence that surrounds every moment, every decision, and every thought, guiding them in subtle ways that are easy to overlook, but impossible to escape. This raises a question that does not have a simple answer, a question that sits quietly beneath everything we observe, waiting to be considered. And that question is whether Gotham is truly responsible for what happens within it, whether it is the cause of the changes we see in the people who live there, or whether it simply reveals what was already present, bringing hidden parts of the human mind into the open where they can no longer be ignored. It is possible that the city acts like a mirror, reflecting back the thoughts and feelings that already exist within a person, making them clearer, stronger, and more difficult to hide. And if this is true, then what we see in Gotham is not something created by the environment, but something uncovered by it. Something that would remain unseen in a different place, but becomes visible here, because of the way the city interacts with the people inside it. At the same time, it is also possible that the constant presence of tension, the steady pressure of uncertainty, and the lack of clear boundaries between safety and danger slowly shape the mind over time, guiding it towards certain patterns, certain ways of thinking, certain ways of responding, until those patterns become deeply rooted, forming a new version of the self that would not have existed without the influence of the environment. Perhaps the truth lies somewhere between these two ideas, in a space where the city and the individual are connected in a continuous exchange, where each influences the other in ways that are not always clear, but always present, creating a cycle that repeats itself over and over, with each new person entering the city, becoming part of that cycle, adding their own experiences to the layers that already exist. And so, as we continue to move deeper into this quiet and complex place, it becomes important to observe not only what happens, but why it happens, to look beyond the surface and consider the forces that shape each moment, each choice, and each transformation, because only by understanding this relationship between the city and the mind can we begin to approach the question that brought us here, the question that lingers in the silence of Gotham's streets and the shadows of its towering structures. Does the city create the darkness we see, slowly guiding those within it toward paths they might never have chosen elsewhere? Or does it simply reveal what was always there, bringing hidden thoughts into the light where they can no longer remain unseen? And if the answer is not one or the other, but something in between, then what does that say about the nature of the people who walk these streets, about the connection between place and identity, about the quiet forces that shape who we become over time? For now, there is no need to rush toward an answer, because Gotham does not demand immediate understanding, and the questions it raises are not meant to be solved quickly, but instead explored slowly, allowed to unfold in their own time, like the city itself, which never reveals everything at once, but instead offers small pieces, small moments, small glimpses into something much larger, something that continues to exist just beyond full understanding, waiting patiently in the shadows, a history built on fractures. As the quiet question of the city lingers in the background, there is a need to look not only at what Gotham feels like in the present, but at how it became this way over time, because no place carries such a heavy atmosphere without a long trail of events that slowly shaped it. And Gotham City did not begin as a place filled with tension and uncertainty, but as a growing settlement that, like many others, was built on hope, trade, and the promise of progress. Yet somewhere along that path, the direction changed, not all at once, but in small and steady ways that were difficult to notice at first. In its earliest days, Gotham grew near water routes that allowed goods to move easily, which meant that people came from different places, bringing their own ideas, skills, and goals. And for a time, this movement created opportunity, allowing the city to expand quickly. Yet growth without careful structure often creates gaps, and within those gaps, certain kinds of power begin to take shape. Not the kind that is visible in official buildings or written laws, but the kind that exists in quiet agreements, in hidden deals, and in decisions made away from public view. It did not take long for individuals and groups to recognize that control could be gained not only through honest work, but through influence. And influence in Gotham began to spread through networks that connected business, politics, and law enforcement in ways that were not always clear, creating a system where decisions could be guided without ever being openly challenged. And as these connections grew stronger, they began to shape the direction of the city in ways that would leave lasting effects. Among these forces were powerful families, groups that did not simply exist within the city, but helped define it. Families who built their names through both visible success and hidden actions, shaping industries, while also controlling less visible operations. And while their presence brought a kind of order to certain areas, it was an order built on control rather than fairness, meaning that stability existed, but only for those who benefited from it. These crime families did not always appear as obvious threats, because much of what they did was done quietly, through influence rather than open conflict. Yet their reach extended into many parts of daily life, shaping outcomes, limiting choices, and creating an environment where rules could be bent or ignored depending on who was involved. And over time, this created a pattern where justice was not applied evenly, but adjusted based on power. As the years passed, this imbalance began to affect not only those directly involved, but also the wider population. Because when systems fail to treat people equally, trust begins to weaken. And when trust weakens, people start to rely more on themselves, sometimes in ways that lead them down paths they might not have considered before, especially when they feel that the usual structures meant to protect them are no longer reliable. There were moments when attempts were made to correct these problems, when individuals within the system tried to restore balance, to bring fairness back into a place that had slowly drifted away from it. But these efforts often faced strong resistance, not always in direct confrontation, but through quiet obstacles, delays, and pressure that made change difficult to maintain. And in many cases, these attempts would fade before they could take full effect. This created a cycle that became deeply rooted in the city's development, a pattern where corruption would rise, be challenged, and then return again in a slightly different form, never fully disappearing. but always adapting, always finding new ways to exist within the structure of the city. And with each cycle, the impact grew stronger, leaving behind marks that were not always visible, but still deeply felt. Violence too followed a similar pattern, not always constant, but appearing in waves, rising during certain periods, and then settling into quieter phases, only to return again later. And these waves did not happen without reason, because they were often tied to shifts in power, changes in control, or struggles between groups, trying to gain or maintain influence. And each time violence appeared, it left behind effects that lasted long after the events themselves had ended. For the people living in Gotham, these repeated patterns became part of their understanding of the world, shaping expectations, influencing behavior, and creating a sense that certain outcomes were almost unavoidable. And while not everyone experienced these cycles in the same way, the overall effect was shared, creating a collective awareness that the city moved in rhythms that were difficult to break. Children growing up in this environment did not always see these patterns clearly, but they felt them in the way adults spoke, in the caution that appeared in certain situations, and in the unspoken rules that guided behavior. And as they grew older, these early impressions began to form a framework through which they understood the world, often shaping their decisions without them even realizing it. In this way, history did not remain in the past, but continued to exist in the present, not as clear memories, but as influences that guided thought and action. And even when people tried to move forward, to create something different, they often found themselves working within a system that had already been shaped by years of repeated patterns, making true change difficult to achieve. There were also places within the city that seemed to hold on to this history more strongly than others, areas where events had left deeper marks, where the past felt closer to the surface. And while these places might appear ordinary to someone unfamiliar with their history, those who knew the stories attached to them understood that they carried more weight than they seemed to at first glance. Over time, the idea of what Gotham was began to form not only from current events, but from everything that had come before, creating a layered identity that was built from both visible and hidden elements. And this identity influenced how the city was seen from the outside, as well as how it was experienced from within, reinforcing the patterns that had already taken hold. It is important to understand that none of this happened through a single event or a single decision, but through a long series of choices, actions, and reactions that built upon one another, each one adding a small piece to a much larger structure. And because of this, there is no simple moment that can be pointed to as the cause, no single point where everything changed, but rather a gradual shift that unfolded over time. As this structure became more established, it began to shape not only the external environment, but also the internal world of the people who lived within it, influencing how they saw themselves, how they understood others, and how they responded to the challenges they faced, often leading them to adopt strategies that matched the environment around them, even if those strategies came with their own risks. This is where the connection between past and present becomes most clear, because the patterns that were formed long ago continue to influence current events, not through direct repetition, but through the way they shape expectations, behavior, and decision-making, creating a sense that the city is caught in a loop, moving forward while also repeating parts of its history at the same time. And so, as we continue to explore the deeper layers of Gotham, it becomes clear that what we see today cannot be separated from what came before, because the city carries its history within it, not as something distant or removed, but as something active, something that continues to shape each moment in quiet and lasting ways. The question then becomes not only how these patterns formed, but whether they can ever be fully broken, or if they will continue to repeat, adapting to new conditions while maintaining the same underlying structure, and whether the people within the city are able to step outside of these patterns, or if they are, in some way, guided by them even when they try to choose a different path. For now, the answers remain uncertain, resting within the same quiet tension that fills the streets and spaces of Gotham, where the past and present exist together, not as separate parts, but as layers of a single story that continues to unfold, shaped by everything that has come before and everything that has yet to happen. The thin line between fear and identity. As the weight of history settles quietly beneath the surface of everything we have begun to understand, attention slowly shifts towards something more personal, something that does not exist only in streets or systems, but within the minds of the people who move through them. Because in Gotham City, it is not only events that shape outcomes, but emotions. And among all emotions, fear holds a special place, not because it is rare, but because it is constant, present in small ways and large ways, guiding choices, even when no one is fully aware of it. Fear in Gotham is not always loud or sudden, like a moment of danger that forces immediate action, but often quiet and steady, like a feeling that stays just beneath awareness, influencing how people walk, how they speak, how they look at others, and even how they think about themselves. And over time, this kind of fear becomes familiar, not something that surprises, but something that is expected, something that feels like part of the environment rather than a reaction to it. For many, fear begins as a natural response, a way to stay safe, a signal that something might be wrong, and in this sense, it serves a purpose, helping people avoid harm, helping them prepare for situations that could be dangerous. And in a place like Gotham, where uncertainty often exists, this kind of awareness can be useful, allowing individuals to move carefully, to notice details, and to respond quickly when needed. But when fear is present too often, when it becomes part of daily life, rather than something that appears only in certain moments, it begins to change its role, shifting from a simple warning into something more powerful, something that not only reacts to the world, but shapes the way the world is seen. And this shift can happen slowly, without clear signs, making it difficult to recognize until it has already taken hold. People begin to make decisions not based on what is actually happening, but on what they believe might happen. And these beliefs are often shaped by past experiences, by stories they have heard, by things they have seen, and by the patterns that exist around them. And as these ideas build over time, they form a kind of internal guide, a set of expectations that influence behavior in ways that feel natural, even if they are not always accurate. In this way, fear becomes more than a reaction, because it starts to act like a tool, something that can be used, shaped, and directed, both by the individual and by others. And in Gotham, this use of fear can be seen in many forms, from those who use it to protect themselves, to those who use it to control situations, and even to those who build their entire identity around it. There are individuals who learn to use fear as a shield, creating a presence that discourages others from getting too close, making it less likely that they will be challenged or harmed. And while this approach can provide a sense of safety, it also creates distance, separating them from others in ways that can become difficult to reverse. Because once fear becomes part of how a person presents themselves, it can begin to replace other parts of their identity. At the same time, there are those who experience fear in such strong ways that it leaves a lasting mark, shaping how they see themselves and their place in the world. And these experiences, often connected to moments of loss, danger, or uncertainty, can become central to their understanding of who they are, influencing not only their actions, but their sense of purpose. When a person begins to define themselves through what they have gone through, especially when those experiences involve fear, their identity can start to form around survival, around the need to avoid harm, to stay in control, or to prevent certain events from happening again. And while this can provide direction, it can also limit possibilities, narrowing the way they see the world and their place within it. Over time, this process can become so complete that the line between fear and identity becomes difficult to see, because what began as a response to a situation has now become part of who the person believes they are. And in Gotham, where fear is often present, This merging can happen in ways that feel almost expected, as if the environment itself encourages it. This does not happen in the same way for everyone, because each person experiences fear differently, and each person responds in their own way. But the common thread is the presence of pressure, the steady influence of an environment that rarely allows for complete ease. And this pressure can shape responses in ways that are both visible and hidden, creating changes that may not always be obvious, but are deeply felt. There are moments when individuals might try to separate themselves from this influence, to step back and see things more clearly, to understand what they are feeling and why. But in a place where fear is so closely tied to daily life, this separation can be difficult, because the conditions that create the feeling remain present, making it hard to fully step outside of it. In some cases, people begin to accept fear as a necessary part of who they are, not something to be removed, but something to be managed, something to be used. And this acceptance can lead to a kind of balance, where fear is neither overwhelming nor ignored, but integrated into daily life in a way that feels stable, even if it is not entirely comfortable. In other cases, the influence of fear can grow stronger, shaping decisions in more direct ways, leading individuals to take actions that are focused on control, on protection, or on avoidance. And these actions, while often understandable, can create patterns that are difficult to change, because they are built on deeply rooted responses that feel necessary for survival. This is where the idea of identity becomes more complex, because it is no longer only about personal choice or natural development, but also about adaptation, about responding to conditions in ways that allow a person to continue moving forward, even if those responses come with certain costs. And in Gotham, these adaptations can take many forms, each shaped by the unique experiences of the individual. Some may become more guarded, choosing to limit their interactions, to keep distance between themselves and others, while others may become more direct, more willing to confront situations head-on, using strength or presence to manage uncertainty. And both approaches, while different, are connected by the same underlying influence: the need to respond to an environment where stability is not always guaranteed. As these patterns continue, they begin to form a kind of structure within the individual, a set of responses and beliefs that guide behavior in consistent ways. And once this structure is established, it can be difficult to change because it feels reliable, it feels safe, even if it was built under conditions that are not ideal. The merging of fear and identity is not always something that leads to negative outcomes, because in some cases, it can create strength, resilience, and awareness, allowing individuals to navigate complex situations with care and understanding. But it can also lead to limitations, to a narrowing of perspective, to a focus on survival that leaves little room for growth beyond it. In Gotham, where the environment continues to present challenges, this balance between strength and limitation becomes an ongoing process, something that must be managed rather than solved, something that shifts over time as conditions change and as individuals respond in new ways. This raises an important question, one that connects back to everything we have been exploring. And that question is not only how fear shapes identity, but whether identity can ever fully exist without it in a place like this, whether it is possible to separate who a person is from the conditions they have adapted to, or whether those conditions will always remain part of the structure that defines them. Perhaps the answer is not clear, because identity is not fixed, but something that continues to change, influenced by new experiences, new understanding, and new choices. And even in a place where fear is present, there may still be room for change, for moments where individuals see themselves differently, where they begin to question the patterns that have guided them for so long. And yet, the presence of fear remains, steady and quiet, shaping the edges of thought, guiding attention, influencing decisions. And as long as it continues to exist in this way, the connection between fear and identity will remain close, not always visible, but always present, forming a part of the larger story that continues to unfold within the city, and within the people who call it home. The birth of the mask. As the quiet connection between fear and identity settles into place, another pattern begins to appear, not all at once, but slowly, as if it has always been there, waiting to be noticed. And in Gotham City, this pattern takes shape in the form of something both simple and complex at the same time, something that can be seen clearly, but is not always easy to understand. And that is the choice many people make to become someone else, not by leaving their lives behind completely, but by creating another version of themselves that exists alongside who they already are. This change does not begin with costumes or symbols, and it does not begin with dramatic moments that are easy to point to, because most of the time, it starts quietly, with a feeling that who they are is not enough to face what surrounds them, or that the world they move through requires something different, something stronger, something more defined. And this feeling grows slowly, shaped by experience, shaped by observation, shaped by the need to respond to a place that does not always offer clear paths. At first, the idea of becoming someone else might feel like a simple thought, a way to imagine a version of oneself that is better prepared, better protected, or better understood. And this imagination can provide comfort, allowing a person to see possibilities that feel out of reach in their current state. And over time, this imagined version begins to take form, gaining details, gaining purpose, becoming more than just a thought. There are many reasons why this shift begins, and while each person may have their own story, there are common threads that can be seen across different lives. Because in a place where pressure is constant and expectations are unclear, the idea of creating a separate identity can feel like a solution, a way to manage what cannot be controlled, a way to respond without exposing everything that lies beneath. For some, this new identity acts as a kind of protection, a barrier between themselves and the world around them, allowing them to take action without feeling completely exposed. And this barrier can provide a sense of safety, not because it removes risk, but because it creates distance, making it easier to face situations that would otherwise feel overwhelming. For others, the change is not only about protection, but about expression, about finding a way to show parts of themselves that do not fit within the expectations placed upon them, parts that might feel too strong, too different, or too difficult to explain. And through this new form, they are able to give those parts a place to exist, a way to be seen, even if it is not always understood. There is also a deeper layer to this transformation, one that relates to escape, not in the sense of leaving the city or avoiding reality completely, but in the sense of stepping outside the limits of a single identity, of creating space where different choices can be made, where different actions can be taken, and where the weight of past experiences does not feel as heavy. This process is not immediate, because moving from one identity to another requires time, requires adjustment, requires a shift, not only in appearance, but in thought, in behavior, in the way a person sees themselves and the world around them. And during this time, there is often a sense of uncertainty, a question of whether this new version is real or temporary, whether it will remain separate or begin to merge with what already exists. As the transformation continues, the lines between the two identities can begin to blur, because actions taken under one identity still belong to the same person, and experiences gained in one form begin to influence the other, creating a connection that grows stronger over time, until it becomes difficult to separate where one ends and the other begins. In Gotham, this merging is influenced by the environment itself, because the conditions that led to the creation of a new identity do not disappear, and as long as those conditions remain, the need for that identity continues, reinforcing its presence and making it more stable, more consistent, more real. There are moments when the original self may feel distant, not because it has been lost completely, but because it no longer feels fully suited to the world around it. And in those moments, the new identity can take a more central role, guiding decisions, shaping actions, becoming the version that feels most capable of handling what needs to be faced. At the same time, there can be a quiet tension that exists beneath this shift, a sense that something is being held apart, something that has not been fully resolved. And this tension can remain even when the new identity feels strong, because it is built on a separation that is never complete, a division that continues to exist within the same person. What makes this process especially complex is that it can lead to both clarity and confusion at the same time, because while the new identity may provide direction and purpose, it can also create questions about what is real, about which version of the self is true, and about whether the separation was ever meant to be permanent or simply a way to cope with specific conditions. In some cases, individuals begin to rely on this new identity so strongly that it becomes their primary way of interacting with the world, not something they switch into, but something they remain within. And as this happens, the original self can become less visible, less active, not because it no longer exists, but because it is no longer the part that leads. This does not mean that the transformation is always negative, because in many situations, it allows people to do things they would not otherwise be able to do, to stand against challenges, to take action, to create change. And in a place like Gotham, where difficulty is often present, this ability can be important, even necessary. However, it also raises questions about balance, about whether it is possible to maintain a connection between different parts of the self without losing one entirely, and whether the act of becoming someone else changes not only how a person acts, but who they are at their core. There is also the question of how others respond to these identities, because once a new form is presented, it becomes part of the environment, something that others react to, something that influences their behavior, and this interaction can further strengthen the identity, giving it meaning not only through personal experience, but through the responses it creates. Over time, this creates a cycle where identity is shaped not only from within, but also from outside, influenced by how it is seen, how it is understood, and how it is challenged. And in Gotham, where reactions can be intense and unpredictable, this cycle can become a powerful force, guiding the development of identity in ways that are difficult to control. As more individuals adopt these alternate forms, the city itself begins to reflect this pattern, becoming a place where identity is fluid, where transformation is common, and where the idea of a single, fixed self becomes less certain, replaced by a more complex understanding of what it means to exist within such an environment. This leads back to the deeper question that continues to follow every part of this journey, the question of whether these changes are a response to the city, or whether they reveal something that was already present, something that simply needed the right conditions to emerge. And as before, the answer does not seem to rest in one direction alone. Perhaps the act of creating a new identity is both a response and a revelation, shaped by the environment, but also shaped by the individual, a meeting point between external pressure and internal possibility, where something new is formed, something that could not exist without both elements working together. And so, as we continue forward, it becomes clear that the story of Gotham is not only about what happens in its streets or within its systems, but also about what happens within the people who live there, about the ways they adapt, the ways they change, and the ways they redefine themselves in response to everything around them, creating identities that are as complex and layered as the city itself. Bruce Wayne, control in the face of chaos. As the idea of shifting identity settles into a steady rhythm, there is one figure whose path seems to stand at the center of this pattern, not because he is the only one who has changed, but because the way he has changed follows a different direction, one that does not move toward escape or expression alone, but toward structure, toward discipline, toward something that feels like control, and that figure is Bruce Wayne, a person whose life began with privilege and comfort, yet was shaped by a single moment that altered everything that came after. There are events that pass through a person's life and leave small marks, and there are events that create a clear divide, separating what came before from what comes after. And for Bruce Wayne, that divide came early, when he was still young, when the world was still simple, when the idea of danger was distant and unclear. And in that moment, when loss entered his life in a way that could not be undone, something changed, not in a loud or visible way at first, but deep within, where understanding begins to take form. For many, such an experience might lead to confusion, to withdrawal, to a slow breaking down of structure and meaning. But in this case, something else began to grow, something that did not remove the pain, but instead gave it direction, turning it into a constant reminder, a point of focus that shaped every decision that followed. And rather than collapsing under the weight of that moment, Bruce Wayne began to build something from it, piece by piece, with patience and purpose. This process was not quick, and it was not simple, because creating structure from something so difficult requires time, requires effort, requires a willingness to face what happened without turning away. And over the years, this effort took many forms, from learning physical skills to developing mental discipline, from studying the patterns of the world around him to understanding how systems work and where they fail. All of it guided by a single goal that remained steady even as everything else changed. In this way, trauma became not an end point, but a starting point, not something that stopped movement, but something that shaped its direction. And while the pain itself did not disappear, it was given a role, a place within a larger structure that allowed it to exist without taking over completely. And this balance, though difficult to maintain, became the foundation of everything that followed. From this foundation, another identity began to form, not as an escape from who he was, but as an extension of it, a way to act in the world that matched the structure he had built within himself. And this identity took shape in the form of Batman, a presence defined not by chaos, but by order, not by reaction alone, but by intention, by planning, by control. The creation of this identity was not based on chance, because every detail was chosen with care, every element designed to serve a purpose, from the way it appears to the way it moves, all of it built to create a clear message, to establish a sense of presence that could influence the environment in ways that words alone could not. And in a city where uncertainty often guides behavior, this kind of presence becomes a powerful tool. Batman does not act randomly, because his actions are guided by structure, by rules that he has set for himself, rules that define what he will do and what he will not do, creating boundaries that allow him to operate within a sense of order, even when everything around him feels unpredictable. And these boundaries are important, because without them, the line between purpose and chaos could become unclear. In many ways, this approach stands in contrast to the patterns seen elsewhere in Gotham, because instead of allowing the environment to shape his actions completely, Bruce Wayne, through Batman, attempts to shape the environment itself, to push back against the patterns that have taken hold, to create a sense of stability where there is little, and to impose a form of order that can exist even in the midst of uncertainty. However, this effort raises an important question, one that does not have an easy answer, because while control can bring structure, it can also create its own form of pressure, and maintaining that level of discipline requires constant effort, constant awareness, constant commitment. And over time, this can become a burden, not because the goal is unclear, but because the path toward it demands so much. There is a kind of tension that exists within this approach, a balance between control and the possibility of losing it, because the more structure is built, the more there is to maintain, and the more difficult it can become to adapt when something does not fit within that structure. And in a place like Gotham, where unpredictability is always present, this challenge becomes even more complex. Bruce Wayne's life reflects this balance, because while he has created a system that allows him to act with purpose, that system is built on something deeply personal, something that cannot be removed or replaced. And this connection means that every action carries more weight. Every decision is tied not only to the present moment, but to the past that shaped it, creating a continuous link between what has been and what is being done now. There are moments when this structure holds firm, when control feels steady, when actions align clearly with intention. And in those moments, the presence of Batman appears almost unshakable, a constant within a shifting environment, something that others can recognize and respond to. And this consistency becomes part of the larger pattern of the city, influencing how events unfold. At the same time, there are moments when the limits of control become visible, when the complexity of the environment pushes against the structure that has been built, and in those moments, the question of stability becomes more difficult to answer, because even the strongest systems can be tested. Even the most careful planning can encounter situations that were not expected. This does not mean that the effort toward control is without value, because without it, the environment might remain completely shaped by chaos, without any form of resistance, without any attempt to create something different. And in that sense, the presence of Batman represents not only a personal response, but a broader effort to shift the balance, to show that structure can exist even in difficult conditions. Yet the deeper question remains, quietly present beneath everything, asking whether this control is entirely stable, or whether it carries within it the same kind of tension that exists elsewhere, whether the effort to maintain order can, over time, become its own form of instability, not in the sense of breaking apart, but in the sense of requiring constant reinforcement to remain intact. It is possible that control, when built on something as strong as trauma, becomes both a strength and a vulnerability, because while it provides direction and purpose, it also ties that purpose to something that cannot be fully resolved, something that continues to exist beneath the surface, influencing everything that grows from it. In this way, the story of Bruce Wayne and Batman becomes not only a story of discipline, but a study of balance, a reflection of how a person can take something difficult and shape it into something structured, something purposeful, while still carrying the weight of what created it. And this balance is not fixed, but something that must be maintained over time, something that shifts as conditions change. As we continue to move forward, this example offers a different perspective on the patterns we have been observing, showing that while the environment of Gotham can influence behavior in powerful ways, individuals can also respond with their own forms of structure, their own methods of shaping the world around them, even if those methods come with their own complexities. And so, the question remains open, not only about Gotham itself, but about the nature of control, about whether it can truly stand apart from the forces it seeks to manage, or whether it will always exist in relation to them, shaped by them even as it attempts to shape them in return, creating a dynamic that continues to evolve with each passing moment. When order becomes obsession, as the effort to create structure continues to take shape, there is a point where something subtle begins to shift, not in a way that is easy to notice at first, but in a way that grows slowly over time. And in Gotham City, this shift often happens when the desire for order becomes so strong that it begins to narrow everything else, turning what was once a clear purpose into something more rigid, something less flexible, something that starts to resist change rather than adapt to it. At the beginning, the idea of control can feel steady and useful because it creates direction. It allows decisions to be made with intention, and it provides a sense of clarity in situations that might otherwise feel uncertain. Yet as this structure becomes stronger, it can also become less open, less willing to adjust. And this is where the first signs of imbalance begin to appear, not as a sudden break, but as a tightening, a gradual closing around a single way of thinking. In a place where conditions are always shifting, where outcomes are rarely predictable, and where each moment can bring something new, the ability to adapt is important. But when control becomes rigid, adaptation becomes difficult, because every situation is measured against a fixed set of expectations. And when those expectations are not met, the response is not always to change, but to push harder, to reinforce the structure rather than question it. This is where purpose begins to change its form, because what started as a clear goal, something that guided action with meaning, slowly becomes something that must be maintained at all costs, something that cannot be adjusted without feeling like it is being lost. And as this feeling grows, the line between choice and necessity becomes less clear until actions are no longer guided by reflection, but by the need to continue. There is a quiet pressure that builds within this process, one that is not always visible from the outside, because the actions themselves may still appear controlled, still appear focused. Yet beneath that surface, there is a growing sense that stopping is not an option, that stepping back is not possible, and that the structure that was created must be sustained without pause, even when it begins to demand more than it once did. This kind of pressure can lead to a change in how decisions are made, because instead of considering different possibilities, the focus becomes narrower, centered only on what fits within the existing structure, and anything outside of that structure begins to feel like a threat, not because it is dangerous, but because it challenges the sense of order that has been carefully built. Even those who began with the clearest intentions, those who set out with a purpose that was grounded in understanding and care, can find themselves moving into this pattern because the environment does not remain still, and as it continues to shift, the effort required to maintain control increases, slowly turning what was once a choice into something that feels like a constant demand. This is where the idea of being a hero becomes more complex, because the role itself carries expectations, not only from others, but from within, expectations that must be met, standards that must be upheld. And when these expectations combine with the pressure to maintain control, they can create a path that becomes difficult to step away from, even when doing so might be necessary. There are moments when the weight of this path becomes more noticeable, moments when the effort to maintain structure begins to feel heavy, when the balance between action and rest becomes uneven, and when the idea of stepping back, even for a short time, feels uncertain, because it raises questions about what might happen in that absence. In these moments, the difference between purpose and compulsion becomes clearer, because purpose allows for reflection, for adjustment, for change, while compulsion continues without pause, driven not by choice, but by the need to continue. And this shift can happen quietly, without a clear point of transition, making it difficult to recognize until it has already taken hold. The transformation from one to the other does not remove the original intention, because that intention remains at the center, but it changes how that intention is expressed, turning it into something that demands constant attention, something that does not allow for space or distance. And this can lead to a narrowing of perspective, where only one path is seen as possible. In Gotham, where the environment itself does not provide clear limits, this narrowing can become even more pronounced, because there is always more to respond to, always more to address. And without clear boundaries, the sense of responsibility can expand endlessly, creating a situation where the effort to maintain order becomes continuous, without a natural point of rest. This continuous effort can affect not only actions, but also identity, because as behavior becomes more focused on maintaining structure, other parts of the self may receive less attention, less space. And over time, this can lead to a kind of imbalance, where one aspect becomes dominant, shaping the way the person sees themselves and the world around them. There is also the question of what happens when control does not produce the expected results, when despite all effort, outcomes remain uncertain. And in these situations, the response can vary, but one common reaction is to increase the level of control, to tighten the structure further, to push harder, believing that more effort will lead to better results, even if the conditions themselves have not changed. This response, while understandable, can create a cycle that is difficult to break, because each time the effort increases, the expectation grows, and when those expectations are not met, the response is to increase the effort again, leading to a pattern that continues without resolution, driven by the belief that control, if applied strongly enough, can overcome any uncertainty. However, the nature of Gotham challenges this belief, because the city does not follow a single pattern, and its conditions are shaped by many different factors, making it difficult for any one approach to fully manage everything that occurs. And this creates a tension between the desire for order and the reality of unpredictability, a tension that must be navigated carefully. There are moments when this tension becomes more visible, when the limits of control are reached, when the effort to maintain structure meets a situation that cannot be easily shaped. And in these moments, the question arises again, not only about the environment, but about the approach itself, about whether the structure being used is still serving its purpose, or whether it has become something that continues simply because it exists. This is not an easy question to answer, because it requires stepping back, requires reflection, requires a willingness to examine what has been built and why. And in a place where constant action feels necessary, finding that space for reflection can be difficult. Yet without it, the pattern continues, and the transformation from purpose to compulsion becomes more complete. The risk here is not only in losing flexibility, but in losing connection to the original reason for action, because when behavior is driven by the need to maintain itself, rather than by the purpose that created it, the direction can shift, becoming less about what is being achieved and more about the act of continuing. And this shift can happen gradually, without clear signs, making it easy to overlook. Even those who stand as symbols of order, those who represent stability in a shifting environment, are not separate from this process, because they operate within the same conditions, facing the same challenges. And while their approach may differ, the influence of the environment remains present, shaping outcomes in ways that are not always visible. And so, as the path continues forward, the question becomes not only how to create order, but how to maintain balance within that order, how to allow for change while still holding on to structure, and how to recognize when control is serving its purpose, and when it has begun to take on a life of its own. In the quiet spaces between action and reflection, this question remains, not demanding an immediate answer, but waiting to be considered, shaping the way each moment is understood, and guiding the ongoing exploration of what it means to seek stability in a place that rarely offers it, and what it means to hold on to purpose without allowing it to become something that can no longer be changed. Joker, chaos without anchor. As the strain of holding structure begins to reveal its limits, another presence moves into focus, not as an answer, but as a contrast so sharp that it changes how everything else is seen. And in Gotham City, this presence does not build systems or follow clear patterns, but instead seems to move without fixed direction, shaping events in ways that are difficult to predict. And that presence is Joker, a figure who does not stand against chaos, but moves within it as if it were the most natural thing in the world. There are individuals who respond to uncertainty by creating rules, by building structure, by trying to reduce the number of unknowns they must face. Yet there are also those who respond in the opposite way, who do not attempt to control the unknown, but instead accept it fully, even lean into it, allowing it to guide their actions. And the Joker represents this second path in its most extreme form, not simply reacting to unpredictability, but becoming a source of it. What makes this presence difficult to understand is not only what he does, but how he does it, because there is no clear pattern that can be followed, no stable set of expectations that can be relied upon, and this absence of consistency creates a kind of tension that spreads outward, affecting not only those who encounter him directly, but also the wider environment. Because once unpredictability is introduced, it changes how others behave, making them more cautious, more uncertain, more aware of possibilities they might not have considered before. At times, his actions can appear random, as if they are guided by nothing at all. But when looked at more closely, there is often a kind of intention beneath the surface. Not in the sense of following a structured plan, but in the sense of challenging structure itself, of questioning the idea that order is something that can be relied upon. And this challenge is not always spoken, but expressed through actions that disrupt expectations, that create confusion, that force others to react rather than prepare. In this way, the Joker becomes more than an individual, because his presence acts like a test, a force that pushes against everything that has been built, not to replace it with something new, but to show how easily it can be broken how quickly stability can shift, and how fragile the idea of control can be when placed under pressure. There is also a philosophy that seems to guide this approach, though it is not always stated clearly, a way of seeing the world that does not place value on structure or predictability, but instead views them as temporary, as something that exists only because people agree to believe in it. And when that belief is shaken, even slightly, the structure begins to weaken, revealing how much of it depends on shared understanding rather than fixed truth. From this perspective, meaning itself becomes something that can be questioned, something that is not solid or permanent, but flexible, shaped by interpretation. And if meaning can change, then the idea of purpose can change as well, leading to a view where actions do not need to follow a clear path, where outcomes do not need to fit into a larger plan, and where freedom is found not in control, but in the absence of it. This idea of freedom is very different from the kind that comes from structure, because it does not rely on boundaries or rules, but instead exists in the space where those boundaries are removed, where choices are not guided by expectation, and where outcomes are not limited by predefined paths. And while this kind of freedom can appear limitless, it also carries uncertainty, because without structure, there is nothing to provide direction, nothing to define what should come next. In Gotham, where the environment already contains uncertainty, this approach does not exist in isolation, because it interacts with everything around it, influencing how others respond, creating reactions that spread outward, and in many cases, forcing individuals to confront questions they might otherwise avoid, questions about why they act the way they do, about what they believe in, and about how much of their behavior is based on choice versus expectation. There are moments when the Joker's presence seems to reflect something back to the city itself, not in a direct or simple way, but in a way that highlights certain patterns, certain tensions, certain contradictions. And this reflection can be uncomfortable, because it does not offer clear answers, but instead reveals complexity, showing how different elements interact in ways that are not always easy to understand. This raises an important question, one that connects deeply to everything we have been exploring. And that question is whether the Joker is a product of Gotham, shaped by the same forces that influence others, or whether he acts as a mirror, reflecting those forces in a way that makes them more visible, more intense, more difficult to ignore. If he is a product, then his presence can be seen as an outcome of the environment, a result of the same pressures, the same patterns, the same conditions that shape many lives within the city, taken to an extreme point where structure is no longer maintained, where unpredictability becomes the primary mode of action, and where meaning is no longer fixed. If he is a mirror, then his presence serves a different role, not as something created by the city, but as something that reveals it, showing what exists beneath the surface, exposing the limits of control, the fragility of systems, and the ways in which order can be disrupted, not because it is weak, but because it depends on conditions that are not always stable. It is also possible that both ideas are true at the same time, that the Joker is both shaped by Gotham and reflective of it, existing at the intersection of environment and response, where internal and external forces meet, creating something that cannot be fully explained by either one alone. And this complexity is part of what makes his presence so difficult to define. For those who encounter him, this uncertainty can be unsettling, because it removes the sense of predictability that allows people to feel prepared, replacing it with a need to react in the moment, to adjust quickly, to think differently, and in doing so, it changes the way they see the world, even if only temporarily, introducing a perspective that challenges their usual understanding. There is also a deeper effect that comes from this interaction, one that goes beyond immediate response, because once the idea that structure can be disrupted so easily is introduced, it can remain in the mind, influencing future thoughts, shaping how situations are interpreted, and creating a sense that stability is not as secure as it once seemed. In this way, the Joker's presence extends beyond individual moments, becoming part of the ongoing pattern of the city, contributing to the sense of tension that exists within it, adding another layer to the complex relationship between order and unpredictability, between structure and freedom, between meaning and the absence of it. Yet even within this complexity, there is a quiet consistency, not in actions, but in the effect those actions have, because regardless of what is done, the result often leads to the same outcome: a shift in perception, a disruption of expectation, a reminder that certainty is not guaranteed, and that the systems people rely on can be challenged in ways they might not anticipate. As we continue to move through this exploration, the presence of the Joker offers a different way of understanding the city, not through structure or control, but through contrast, through the space where those things are absent, and in that space, new questions begin to form, not only about what Gotham is, but about what it reveals, about the balance between order and chaos, and about the ways in which both are connected, shaping the world in ways that are not always clear, but always present. Laughter as a breaking point. As the presence of unpredictability continues to echo through the city, another element begins to rise quietly alongside it. Something that at first seems harmless, something that usually brings comfort or lightness. Yet in Gotham City, it can take on a very different form, and that element is laughter, a sound that normally signals joy or relief, but here, under certain conditions, begins to feel different, not entirely warm, not entirely safe, but instead carrying a tone that is harder to place, something that feels slightly out of step with the moment in which it appears. Laughter is often understood as a natural response, a way for people to release tension, to respond to something unexpected, or to share a moment with others. And in many places, it serves as a connection, a signal that something is understood, something is shared, and something is safe enough to allow that reaction to surface. Yet when the environment is filled with uncertainty, when stability is not always present, the role of laughter can begin to change in subtle but important ways. In situations where pressure builds slowly, where fear or confusion remains beneath the surface, laughter can become a form of release, a way to let go of tension that has been held for too long. And in this sense, it still serves a useful purpose, allowing the mind to reset, to step away from intensity, even if only for a short time. And this kind of laughter can be soft, brief, and closely tied to the moment that created it. However, when the pressure does not ease, when uncertainty continues without pause, and when the need for release becomes more frequent, laughter can begin to appear in places where it does not fully belong, emerging not because something is truly light or humorous, but because the mind is searching for a way to manage what it cannot fully process. And in these moments, the sound may feel disconnected, slightly out of place, as if it does not match the situation around it. This shift can be difficult to notice at first, because laughter still sounds familiar, still carries the same rhythm, yet the feeling behind it begins to change, becoming less about shared understanding and more about internal response, something that happens within a person rather than between people. And this change can create a sense of distance, even when others are present. There are times when laughter acts as a form of defense, a way to avoid fully engaging with what is happening, a way to create space between the individual and the situation. And this can be especially true in environments where direct confrontation with reality feels overwhelming, because by responding with laughter, even briefly, the mind is able to step away from the full weight of the moment. This does not mean that the situation becomes easier, but it changes how it is experienced, creating a layer between what is happening and how it is felt. And over time, this layer can become more consistent, appearing more often, shaping the way responses are formed, until laughter is no longer simply a reaction, but a pattern, something that occurs even when it is not expected. As this pattern develops, the connection between emotion and situation can begin to weaken, because the response no longer matches the event in a clear way. And when this happens repeatedly, it can create a sense of confusion, both for the individual and for those around them, because the signals that are usually used to understand each other become less reliable, less consistent. In Gotham, where the environment already challenges clear understanding, this kind of disconnect can become more noticeable because it adds another layer to the complexity, making it harder to interpret behavior, harder to predict reactions, and harder to maintain a sense of shared experience, as each person may be responding in ways that are shaped by internal processes rather than external events. There are also moments when laughter becomes more intense, not just appearing at unexpected times, but continuing beyond the point where it would normally stop, as if the release it provides is not enough, as if the need to let go of tension continues even after the initial response. And in these moments, the sound can take on a different quality, one that feels less controlled, less tied to intention, and more connected to something deeper. This kind of response can be unsettling, not because it is loud or dramatic, but because it reveals a gap, a space where emotion and reality no longer align in the way they usually do. And this gap can raise questions about what is being felt, about how experiences are being processed, and about how the mind is adapting to conditions that are difficult to manage. The idea of laughter as distortion begins to take shape here, because it no longer reflects what is happening in a direct way, but instead alters it, reshaping the experience, changing its meaning, and creating a version of the moment that is different from what might be expected. And while this can provide temporary relief, it can also create long-term effects, influencing how future situations are interpreted. When this pattern continues, the boundary between internal experience and external reality can become less clear, because the signals that usually help to distinguish between the two are no longer consistent. And this can lead to a sense of disconnection, not only from others, but from the environment itself, as the usual ways of understanding what is happening begin to shift. This does not happen suddenly, because it is built over time through repeated moments where the response does not fully match the situation, where the need for release, defense, or distance shapes behavior more strongly than the immediate context. And as these moments accumulate, they begin to form a pattern that influences how future experiences are approached. In some cases, individuals may become aware of this change, noticing that their responses feel different, that their reactions do not always align with what they expect. And this awareness can create its own kind of tension, a sense of uncertainty about how to respond, about what is appropriate, and about how to reconnect with a more stable understanding of emotion. In other cases, the pattern may continue without clear awareness, becoming part of the way the person interacts with the world, shaping their behavior in ways that feel natural, even if they appear unusual from the outside. And in this way, laughter becomes integrated into identity, not as a simple expression of joy, but as a complex response shaped by the conditions of the environment. The presence of this pattern also affects how others respond, because when signals become unclear, interactions become more difficult to navigate, leading to hesitation, misunderstanding, or distance. And this can further reinforce the sense of separation, creating a cycle where disconnection leads to more disconnection, each part influencing the other. Within the larger context of Gotham, this adds another dimension to the ongoing balance between order and unpredictability, because it shows how even basic forms of expression can be influenced by the environment, changing their meaning, changing their role, and contributing to the overall atmosphere in ways that are subtle but significant. This brings us back to the question of how deeply the environment shapes the individual, because if something as simple as laughter can change in this way, then it suggests that the influence extends beyond actions and decisions, reaching into the core of how experiences are felt and expressed, shaping not only what people do, but how they understand what they are doing. And so, as the journey continues, the sound of laughter remains, but it carries with it a new meaning, a reminder that even the most familiar responses can shift under certain conditions, that even the simplest expressions can become complex, and that within the quiet tension of the city, every part of the human experience can be shaped in ways that are not always easy to see, but are always present, waiting to be understood. Harvey Dent and the Fragility of Justice. As the shifting patterns of emotion continue to shape the way people respond to the world around them, there comes a point where attention turns toward justice itself, toward the idea that there can be fairness, balance, and clear rules that guide what is right and what is wrong. And in Gotham City, this idea has always existed, not only as a hope, but as something people have tried to build and protect, even when the conditions around them make that effort difficult to maintain. Among those who once carried this idea with strong belief is Harvey Dent, a figure who did not begin as a symbol of division or uncertainty, but as someone who believed deeply in structure, in fairness, and in the possibility that the system, even if imperfect, could be shaped into something better through effort, discipline, and persistence. In the early part of his path, Harvey Dent represents a kind of clarity that stands out in a place filled with complexity, because his approach is built on the idea that rules matter, that actions have consequences, and that justice can be applied in a way that is consistent and meaningful, creating a sense of stability that others can rely on. And this belief is not simple or naive, but grounded in the understanding that, without structure, the environment becomes even more uncertain. There is a kind of strength in this belief, because it requires patience, requires commitment, and requires the ability to continue even when progress is slow. And for a time, this approach creates results, small changes that suggest improvement is possible, small moments where the balance shifts slightly toward fairness, even if only for a short time. However, as with many efforts in Gotham, this path does not exist without pressure, because the systems that Harvey Dent works within are not separate from the forces that have shaped the city. And as he continues to move forward, he encounters resistance, not always direct, but persistent, creating obstacles that challenge his belief in the system he is trying to support. Over time, these challenges begin to build, not only as external difficulties, but as internal tension, because each moment where the system fails to act as expected raises questions, not only about how it operates, but about whether it can truly achieve the fairness it promises. And these questions do not appear all at once, but grow gradually, shaped by repeated experiences that do not align with the original belief. There is a moment, or perhaps a series of moments, where the balance begins to shift, where the confidence that once guided action starts to weaken, not disappearing completely, but becoming less certain, less stable. And as this happens, the clear structure that once defined his approach begins to show signs of strain, small cracks that widen over time. This shift does not erase the original intention, because the desire for fairness remains, but it changes how that intention is expressed, creating a conflict between what is believed and what is experienced. And this conflict can become difficult to manage, because it challenges the foundation upon which identity has been built. As this tension continues, the idea of justice itself begins to transform, moving away from a fixed structure towards something less certain, something that no longer relies entirely on rules and systems, but begins to incorporate another element, something that feels more immediate, more direct, yet also less stable. This transformation becomes visible in the emergence of Two-Face, not as a completely separate being, but as a reflection of division, a way of expressing the conflict that has grown within, where two opposing views exist side by side, each shaped by different experiences, each influencing the way decisions are made. Two-Face represents a form of duality that is both simple and complex at the same time, because on one level, it presents a clear division, a separation between two sides, yet on another level, it reflects a deeper struggle, a question of how to reconcile opposing ideas when both feel valid, when both are supported by experience, and when neither can be fully dismissed. The method through which decisions are made in this new state introduces an element that stands in contrast to the structured approach that came before, because instead of relying on consistent rules, outcomes begin to depend on chance, on a simple action that removes the need for extended judgment, replacing it with something immediate and final. This shift toward randomness is significant because it changes the role of responsibility, moving it away from deliberate choice and placing it into the hands of something that cannot be controlled. And while this can provide a sense of relief from the burden of decision-making, it also removes the structure that once guided those decisions, creating a new form of uncertainty. In this way, the idea of fate begins to take the place of structured morality, not as a carefully defined system, but as a simple mechanism that determines outcomes without requiring deeper reflection. And this mechanism, while consistent in its process, produces results that are unpredictable, depending entirely on the moment rather than on established principles. This does not mean that the original belief in justice has disappeared, because it remains present, influencing how situations are viewed, creating a constant interaction between the past and the present, between the structured approach that once existed and the new method that has taken its place. And this interaction creates a dynamic that is both stable and unstable at the same time. For those observing from the outside, this transformation can appear sudden, a clear break between one identity and another. Yet when looked at more closely, it becomes clear that it is the result of a gradual process, a series of changes that built upon each other, each one shaping the next, until the final form emerges as a reflection of everything that came before. Within the larger context of Gotham, this example highlights the fragility of systems that rely on consistency in an environment that does not always support it, showing how even strong beliefs can be challenged, how even well-structured approaches can encounter limits, and how the response to those limits can take unexpected forms. It also raises questions about the nature of justice itself, about whether it can remain stable in a place where conditions are constantly shifting, or whether it must adapt, changing its form in response to the environment. And if it does change, how much of its original meaning can be preserved, and how much is lost in the process. The presence of Two-Face introduces another layer to this question, because it shows what can happen when the balance between belief and experience becomes difficult to maintain, when the effort to hold on to structure meets repeated challenges, and when the need for resolution leads to the adoption of a method that simplifies decision-making at the cost of consistency. As the story continues, this transformation serves as a reminder that identity is not fixed, that it can change in response to both internal and external forces, and that these changes are not always clear or predictable, but are shaped by the interaction between what is believed and what is experienced over time. And so, within the ongoing exploration of Gotham, the example of Harvey Dent and Two-Face stands as a reflection of how ideals can evolve, how structure can shift, and how the search for fairness can take different forms depending on the conditions in which it exists, leaving behind questions that do not demand immediate answers, but instead invite continued observation, continued understanding, and a deeper look into the connections that shape both the city and the people within it, the city's influence on moral balance. As the shifting forms of justice begin to reveal how easily structure can bend under pressure, attention moves outward again, returning to the environment itself, because the changes seen in individuals do not exist in isolation, and in Gotham City there is a constant interaction between place and person, a quiet exchange that shapes thought, shapes choice, and shapes the way right and wrong are understood, often in ways that are not immediately clear. There is something about Gotham that slowly affects certainty, not by removing it all at once, but by softening its edges over time, making what once felt clear begin to feel uncertain. And this does not happen through a single event or a single moment, but through repeated experiences where outcomes do not match expectations, where actions do not lead to the results that were believed to follow, and where the connection between cause and effect becomes harder to trace. At first, this shift may seem small, because people still hold on to their understanding of what is right, still rely on what they have learned, still try to apply those ideas in their daily lives. Yet as they continue to move through the environment, they begin to encounter situations that challenge those ideas, not directly, but through complexity, through conditions that do not fit into simple categories, and through outcomes that do not align with clear rules. Over time, these experiences begin to build, creating a sense that the usual ways of understanding may not be enough. And as this feeling grows, people start to adjust, not always consciously, but in subtle ways, becoming more cautious in their judgments, more flexible in their thinking, and sometimes more uncertain in their conclusions, because the clarity they once relied on is no longer as stable as it seemed. This erosion of certainty does not remove the idea of morality, because people still care about what is right and wrong, still want to make good choices, still try to act in ways that align with their values. But the framework they use to make those decisions becomes less defined, less consistent, shaped by conditions that change from moment to moment. In Gotham, this process is influenced by many factors, from the presence of power structures that do not always act in expected ways, to the unpredictable nature of events that can shift without warning. And these factors create an environment where clear answers are difficult to maintain, where each situation must be considered on its own terms, and where the idea of a fixed rule can feel limited. As this continues, individuals may find themselves moving towards stronger positions, not because they seek extremes, but because the middle ground becomes harder to hold. And when balance feels uncertain, it can be easier to lean fully in one direction or another, choosing a clear stance rather than navigating a space that feels unstable. Some may respond by holding more tightly to their original beliefs, reinforcing their sense of right and wrong, making their decisions more direct, more firm, as a way to maintain clarity in an environment that challenges it. And this approach can provide a sense of stability, a way to remain grounded even when conditions shift. Others may respond in the opposite way, becoming more flexible, more willing to adapt their views based on the situation, allowing context to guide their decisions rather than fixed rules. And while this can create openness, it can also lead to uncertainty, because without clear boundaries, each choice requires more thought, more consideration, more effort to determine what is appropriate. Both of these responses are shaped by the same environment, reflecting different ways of managing the same challenge, and both carry their own strengths and difficulties, because neither approach fully removes the uncertainty that exists, and both must continue to adjust as conditions change. There is also a deeper effect that begins to take shape, one that goes beyond individual decisions and influences how people see the concept of morality itself. Because when clarity is repeatedly challenged, the idea of right and wrong can begin to feel less absolute, less fixed, and more dependent on context, more connected to the specific details of each situation. This shift does not mean that morality disappears, but it changes how it is experienced, moving it from a clear structure into something more fluid, something that must be understood in relation to the environment. And this can create a sense of instability, because without a solid foundation, it becomes harder to feel certain about decisions, harder to feel confident in outcomes. In Gotham, where conditions often push against stability, this fluidity can lead to situations where individuals feel pulled in different directions, where competing ideas of what is right exist at the same time, and where choosing one path means leaving another behind, not because one is clearly correct, but because the situation demands a decision. This pressure can create a kind of tension that builds over time, a sense that each choice carries weight, not only because of its immediate effect, but because of what it represents, because of how it aligns with or challenges the individual's understanding of themselves. And this tension can influence behavior in ways that are both visible and hidden. As people navigate this environment, they may begin to rely more on immediate outcomes than on long-term principles, focusing on what works in the moment rather than what fits within a larger framework. And while this can be effective in certain situations, it can also lead to a gradual shift away from consistent standards, creating a pattern where decisions are shaped more by circumstance than by belief. This does not happen suddenly, because it is built through experience, through repeated moments where the environment challenges expectations, where the results of actions are not predictable, and where the need to respond quickly takes priority over the need to reflect deeply. And as these moments accumulate, they begin to shape how future decisions are made. There is also the influence of others, because in a place where clarity is limited, people look to each other for guidance, for cues on how to respond. And this interaction creates a shared understanding that evolves over time, shaped by collective experience. And this shared understanding can reinforce certain patterns, making them feel more natural, more accepted, even if they differ from what once seemed clear. Within this dynamic, the line between right and wrong becomes less defined, not because it no longer exists, but because it is harder to see, harder to hold on to, and harder to apply consistently. And this can create a sense of imbalance, a feeling that the ground beneath each decision is not entirely stable, that it may shift depending on conditions that are not fully under control. This loss of stable ground does not mean that choices are made without care, because people still consider their actions, still think about consequences, still try to do what feels right, but the process becomes more complex, requiring constant adjustment, constant awareness, and constant navigation of a space that does not remain fixed. In Gotham, this ongoing process becomes part of daily life, shaping how individuals interact with the world, influencing how they respond to challenges, and contributing to the overall atmosphere of the city, where certainty is not always present, and where clarity must be found rather than assumed. As we continue to explore this environment, it becomes clear that the influence of the city extends deeply into the way morality is experienced, not by removing it, but by reshaping it, by challenging it, and by requiring it to adapt to conditions that are constantly changing, creating a dynamic that is both complex and ongoing. And so, the question remains, not only about what is right and wrong, but about how those ideas can be understood and applied in a place where stability is not guaranteed, where each decision exists within a shifting context, and where the search for clarity is itself part of the journey, something that continues to unfold with each moment, shaped by the interaction between environment and choice. Jonathan Crane and the Science of Fear. As the shifting sense of right and wrong continues to settle into something less certain, attention turns toward a different kind of influence, one that does not simply appear through experience or environment alone, but is studied, observed, and shaped with intention. And in Gotham City, this approach is represented through the work of Jonathan Crane, a figure who does not just feel fear or react to it, but seeks to understand it, to examine how it works, how it grows, and how it can be used in ways that reach far beyond a single moment. Fear, as it exists naturally, is something that arises within the mind as a response to perceived danger, something that helps individuals prepare, something that sharpens attention and encourages caution. And in this basic form, it serves a clear purpose, helping people recognize when something might be wrong, guiding them towards safety, and allowing them to respond quickly when needed. However, when fear is studied closely, when it is broken down into its parts and examined in detail, it becomes clear that it is not only a reaction, but a process, one that involves perception, memory, and interpretation. And this understanding opens the possibility of influence, because if fear can be understood, then it can also be shaped, altered, and directed. Jonathan Crane approaches fear from this perspective, not as something to avoid, but as something to explore, to measure, and to use. And this approach changes the role of fear entirely, turning it from a natural response into a tool, something that can be applied with purpose, something that can be used to create specific outcomes, and something that can reach into the mind in ways that are both direct and subtle. At the center of this transformation is the realization that fear does not always depend on reality alone, because what a person experiences as fear is often shaped by what they believe to be true, by what they expect, and by what they remember. And if these elements can be influenced, then the experience of fear can be altered as well, creating a version of reality that feels real, even if it does not fully match what is actually present. This idea becomes especially important when considering how perception works. because perception is not a direct copy of the world, but an interpretation, a process where the mind takes in information and makes sense of it based on previous experience. And when fear enters this process, it can change the interpretation, making certain details more important, making certain possibilities feel more likely, and making certain outcomes feel more immediate. Through this understanding, fear becomes something that can be amplified, increased beyond its natural level, not by changing the environment itself, but by changing how the environment is perceived. And this amplification can create a powerful effect because it influences not only what is seen, but how it is understood, shaping the entire experience of a situation. The identity that emerges from this approach is Scarecrow, a form that represents fear not just as a feeling, but as a presence, something that can be introduced into a situation deliberately, something that can take control of perception and guide it towards specific outcomes. And in this form, fear is no longer passive, but active, no longer reactive, but directed. Scarecrow serves as a symbol of internal terror, not because he creates something entirely new, but because he brings forward what already exists within the mind, drawing out fears that may have been hidden or suppressed, and presenting them in ways that feel immediate and unavoidable, creating an experience that feels real, even if it is shaped by influence rather than direct reality. This process highlights an important idea, which is that fear does not need to be based on actual danger to have an effect, because once the mind believes something to be true, the body responds, emotions follow, and behavior changes. And this chain of response can occur even when the original cause is not present in the way it appears. In Gotham, where the environment already contains uncertainty, this kind of influence can be especially strong because the conditions that support fear are already in place, making it easier for perception to shift, easier for the mind to accept what it is presented with, and easier for fear to grow beyond its original source. There are moments when individuals under the influence of amplified fear begin to see the world differently, where familiar surroundings take on new meanings, where ordinary details become sources of concern, and where the boundary between what is real and what is imagined becomes less clear, not because the environment has changed, but because perception has been altered. This change can affect decision-making in significant ways, because when perception is shaped by fear, choices are guided by what is believed to be happening rather than what is actually present. And this can lead to actions that are focused on avoiding perceived threats, even if those threats are not fully grounded in reality. Over time, repeated exposure to this kind of influence can have lasting effects, because it changes how the mind processes information, creating patterns where fear becomes a central part of interpretation, where uncertainty is approached with caution, and where the possibility of danger is given more weight than other considerations. This does not mean that individuals lose the ability to understand reality, but it does mean that their perception becomes influenced by patterns that were shaped through repeated experiences, making it more difficult to separate immediate reality from internal interpretation, especially in situations that are already complex. The presence of Scarecrow also raises questions about the ethics of using fear in this way, because while fear can be a powerful tool, it can also create harm, not only in the moment, but in the long term, shaping how individuals experience the world, influencing how they respond to future situations, and altering their sense of stability. In the broader context of Gotham, this approach adds another layer to the already complex relationship between environment and perception, showing how external influence can interact with internal processes, creating experiences that are shaped by both, and reinforcing the idea that understanding what is real is not always as simple as it seems. It also connects back to the earlier idea that the city itself influences how people think and feel, because when fear is used in this way, it becomes part of that influence, contributing to the overall atmosphere, adding to the sense of uncertainty, and shaping how individuals interpret the world around them. The idea that fear can reshape perception entirely suggests that reality is not only what exists externally, but also how it is experienced internally. And this means that changes in perception can have effects that are just as strong as changes in the environment itself, influencing behavior, shaping identity, and guiding decisions. As we continue to explore the deeper layers of Gotham, the presence of Jonathan Crane and Scarecrow highlights the importance of understanding not only what happens, but how it is perceived, because the way events are interpreted can be just as important as the events themselves. And in a place where perception can be influenced so strongly, this distinction becomes even more significant. And so, the journey moves forward with a deeper awareness of how fear operates, not only as a natural response, but as something that can be studied, shaped, and amplified, influencing the way reality is experienced and contributing to the ongoing complexity of a city where the line between what is seen and what is felt is not always clear, but always present. Isolation in a crowded city. As the understanding of fear deepens and its influence becomes clearer, another quiet pattern begins to reveal itself, one that does not always appear through action or visible change, but instead exists in the spaces between people, in the pauses within conversations, in the moments when connection is expected but does not fully arrive. And in Gotham City, this pattern takes the form of isolation, not in the sense of being physically alone, but in the sense of feeling separate even when surrounded by others. At first, this may seem difficult to understand because Gotham is not empty. It is filled with movement, filled with voices, filled with people going about their lives. And yet within this constant presence, there is a kind of distance that can exist, a feeling that despite the closeness of bodies and the overlap of paths, something important is missing. Something that would normally create a sense of togetherness. There are places where crowds gather, where the sound of activity fills the air, where lights remain on late into the night, and where the presence of others should bring comfort. Yet, in these spaces, it is still possible to feel alone, not because there is no one nearby, but because the connection between individuals is not fully formed, not strong enough to create a shared sense of understanding. This kind of isolation is not always visible because it does not show itself in obvious ways. It does not require silence or emptiness to exist. And because of this, it can be overlooked, even by those experiencing it, becoming part of the background, something that is felt but not always named, something that shapes experience without being directly addressed. In a place where uncertainty and pressure already exist, this emotional distance can become more significant because connection often serves as a source of stability, a way to share experiences, to find support, and to create a sense of belonging. And when that connection is limited or absent, the ability to manage challenges can become more difficult. There are moments when individuals reach out, not always in clear ways, but through small actions, through attempts to connect, through efforts to be understood. And when these moments do not lead to the response that is hoped for, when the connection does not form as expected, the sense of distance can grow, creating a feeling that communication is incomplete, that something is missing between intention and response. Over time, these experiences can build, not as a single event, but as a series of moments that reinforce a pattern, leading individuals to expect that connection may not always be available. And as this expectation grows, it can influence behavior, leading to hesitation, to withdrawal, or to a reduced effort to reach out, because the outcome feels uncertain. This process can create a cycle where the lack of connection leads to less interaction, and less interaction leads to a greater sense of isolation. And within this cycle, it becomes more difficult to break the pattern, because each part reinforces the other, creating a steady movement away from shared experience. In Gotham, where conditions already challenge stability, this cycle can have a strong effect, because without connection, individuals must rely more heavily on themselves, managing their thoughts and emotions without the support that might otherwise help to balance them. And this increased reliance can lead to strain, especially when facing situations that are complex or difficult to understand. There are also moments when connection is most needed, moments when the weight of experience becomes heavy, when uncertainty feels overwhelming, and when the presence of another person could provide clarity or comfort. And it is in these moments that the absence of connection can have the greatest impact, because the gap between need and response becomes more noticeable. This gap does not always lead to immediate change, but it can influence how individuals see their situation, shaping their understanding of what is possible, and guiding their decisions in ways that reflect the belief that they must handle things alone, even when that may not be the most effective approach. Emotional isolation can also affect how people interpret the actions of others, because without strong connection, it becomes more difficult to understand intention, more difficult to read signals, and more likely that misunderstandings will occur. And these misunderstandings can further increase distance, creating barriers that make connection even harder to achieve. In this way, isolation becomes not only a result of certain conditions, but also a factor that contributes to those conditions, influencing how individuals interact, how they respond, and how they navigate the environment around them, creating a pattern that continues over time. There is also a deeper aspect to this experience, one that relates to identity, because connection often plays a role in how individuals understand themselves, providing feedback, reflection, and shared perspective. And when this is limited, the process of self-understanding can become more isolated as well, shaped primarily by internal thought rather than by interaction. This can lead to a narrowing of perspective, where ideas are not challenged or expanded through discussion, where interpretations remain untested, and where beliefs can become more fixed or more uncertain, depending on the individual and their experiences. In some cases, individuals may create their own forms of connection, finding ways to interact that feel safe or manageable, even if they are limited. And these forms of connection can provide some support, some sense of shared experience, yet they may not fully replace the broader connections that are needed to create a strong sense of belonging. There are also those who respond to isolation by becoming more focused on their own internal world, developing their thoughts, their ideas, and their responses in ways that are deeply personal. And while this can lead to clarity in some areas, it can also increase distance from others, reinforcing the sense of separation that already exists. Within the larger context of Gotham, this pattern of isolation adds another layer to the environment, influencing how people experience the city, not only through what happens around them, but through what does not happen between them, through the connections that are missing or incomplete, and through the quiet spaces where understanding does not fully form. This brings attention back to the importance of connection in shaping stability, because without it, the ability to manage uncertainty becomes more difficult, and the influence of other factors, such as fear, pressure, and unpredictability, can become stronger, filling the space that connection might otherwise occupy. As we continue to explore the deeper structure of Gotham, it becomes clear that isolation is not simply a background condition, but an active part of the environment, shaping experience, influencing behavior, and contributing to the overall pattern of how individuals respond to the world around them. And so, within the movement of the city, where voices continue, where paths cross, and where lives overlap, there remains a quiet distance, a space where connection could exist but does not always take hold. And in that space, the experience of isolation continues, subtle but powerful, shaping the way individuals move forward, shaping the choices they make, and shaping the story that continues to unfold within the city. Systems that fail quietly, as the quiet distance between people continues to shape how experiences are felt. Attention turns toward another layer that operates beneath daily life, something less visible than individual emotion but just as influential. And in Gotham City, this layer takes the form of systems, the structures that are meant to support, protect, and guide, including law enforcement, healthcare, and governance, each designed to create stability, yet over time, each showing signs of strain that are not always loud or immediate, but steady and persistent. These systems are built with clear purposes, meant to respond to harm, to provide care, and to organize the way a city functions. and when they operate as intended, they can create a sense of reliability, allowing people to trust that certain needs will be met, that certain problems will be addressed, and that there is a structure in place that supports the larger community. However, in Gotham, these systems do not always function in this ideal way, not because they have failed completely, but because they have developed weaknesses over time. Small issues that have grown without being fully resolved, creating gaps where support does not reach as it should, and where responses do not align with expectations. In law enforcement, there are moments when action is taken, when effort is visible, and when attempts are made to address challenges. Yet there are also moments when response is delayed, when resources are limited, and when the ability to act is influenced by factors that are not always clear, creating a pattern where outcomes are inconsistent, where protection is not always guaranteed. This inconsistency affects how people see the system, because trust is built not only on intention, but on reliability, and when reliability becomes uncertain, the sense of safety that should come from these structures begins to weaken, leading individuals to question whether they can depend on them in moments that matter most. In healthcare, a similar pattern can be observed, where care is available, yet not always accessible in the ways that are needed, where support exists, but is sometimes limited by resources, by timing, or by the ability to reach those who require it. And this creates a situation where individuals must navigate their needs within a system that does not always respond fully or immediately. This does not mean that care is absent, but that it is uneven, and this unevenness can lead to delays, to missed opportunities for support, and to situations where issues that could have been addressed early continue to develop, becoming more difficult to manage over time. Governance, which is meant to provide direction and coordination, also shows signs of strain, where decisions are made, yet not always implemented effectively, where plans are created, yet not always carried through, and where communication between different parts of the system does not always flow smoothly, creating gaps where coordination is needed, but not fully achieved. These patterns do not exist separately, because each system interacts with the others, and when one shows weakness, it can affect the others, creating a network of influence where small issues can spread, where gaps can overlap, and where the overall effect becomes larger than any single part. For individuals living within this environment, the impact of these quiet failures is not always immediate, because each gap may seem small on its own, each delay manageable, each inconsistency something that can be worked around. Yet over time, these small moments begin to accumulate, creating a larger effect that shapes how people experience the world. This accumulation is subtle, because it does not announce itself. It does not arrive as a single event, but builds slowly, through repeated experiences where support is incomplete, where responses are uncertain, and where expectations are not fully met. And as this continues, it begins to influence how individuals think, how they plan, and how they respond to challenges. There are moments when people begin to adjust their expectations, lowering them slightly, preparing for the possibility that systems may not respond as needed, and this adjustment can lead to changes in behavior, where individuals rely more on themselves, where they seek alternative ways to manage situations, and where they become more cautious in their interactions with these structures. This increased reliance on the self can create strength, encouraging independence and resourcefulness. Yet it can also create strain, because not all challenges can be managed alone, and when support is needed but not fully available, the weight of responsibility becomes heavier, more difficult to carry over time. The connection between system failure and individual experience becomes more visible in these moments, because it shows how external structures influence internal states, how gaps in support can lead to increased pressure, and how repeated exposure to these conditions can shape the way individuals respond to the world around them. There are also situations where individuals reach a point where the accumulation of these experiences begins to affect their sense of stability, where the combination of limited support, increased responsibility, and ongoing uncertainty creates a level of strain that becomes difficult to manage, leading to changes in behavior, in perception, and in the way they navigate their environment. This does not happen in a single moment, but through a gradual process where each experience adds to the next, where each gap reinforces the pattern, and where the overall effect becomes more noticeable over time, shaping not only individual outcomes, but the broader atmosphere of the city. Within Gotham, this pattern contributes to the sense that stability is something that must be actively maintained rather than naturally provided, creating an environment where individuals are constantly adjusting, constantly responding, and constantly managing conditions that do not remain fixed. It also influences how people interact with each other, because when systems do not fully support connection, individuals may find it more difficult to build and maintain relationships, as they are focused on managing their own needs, navigating their own challenges, and responding to an environment that requires constant attention. This creates a cycle where system weaknesses contribute to individual strain, and individual strain contributes to a broader sense of instability, reinforcing the conditions that led to the initial gaps and making it more difficult to restore balance without addressing the underlying issues. The quiet nature of these failures makes them especially challenging because they do not draw immediate attention, they do not demand urgent response, and because of this, they can continue for long periods without being fully addressed, becoming part of the background, something that is accepted rather than questioned. Yet despite this, their impact remains, shaping the way the city functions, influencing how people experience it, and contributing to the patterns that have been observed throughout this exploration, connecting the external structure of the environment with the internal experiences of those who live within it. As the journey continues, it becomes clear that understanding Gotham requires looking not only at visible events or individual actions, but also at these underlying systems, at the ways they support or fail to support, and at how their condition influences everything that happens above them. And so, within the steady movement of the city, where actions unfold and decisions are made, there exists a quieter layer, one that operates without drawing attention, yet holds significant influence, shaping outcomes in subtle ways, and contributing to the ongoing story of how a place and its people interact, adapt, and respond to the conditions that define their shared experience. The normalization of madness. As the quiet strain of weakened systems continues to shape daily life, another pattern begins to form, one that is not sudden or dramatic, but gradual, almost unnoticeable at first. And in Gotham City, this pattern appears in the way people begin to respond to what surrounds them, not by resisting it fully, but by adjusting to it, by making space for it, until what once felt unusual slowly becomes familiar. There was a time when certain events would have caused pause, when people would stop, reflect, and try to understand what had happened, because it stood outside what they expected from their environment. Yet, as these events repeat, as they appear again and again in slightly different forms, the response begins to change, becoming less immediate, less intense, and more measured, as if the mind is learning to absorb them without reacting in the same way. This change does not mean that people stop noticing entirely, because awareness remains, but it becomes quieter, less urgent, as if the experience has been placed into a category that no longer demands the same level of attention. And this shift allows individuals to continue with their routines, to move through their day without being stopped by every unexpected moment. Over time, this adjustment becomes part of daily life, shaping how situations are interpreted, how responses are formed, and how expectations are set. And as a result, behaviors that once stood out as extreme begin to blend into the background, not because they have changed, but because the context around them has shifted. This process can be understood as a form of adaptation, a way for individuals to manage an environment that presents repeated challenges, because without this adjustment, the constant need to react would become overwhelming, making it difficult to function, to maintain focus, or to continue with everyday tasks. In this sense, normalization serves a purpose, allowing people to create a sense of stability within instability, to find a way to move forward even when conditions are not ideal. And this ability to adapt can be seen as a form of resilience, a way of maintaining continuity in a place where change is constant. However, this adaptation also has deeper effects, because as behaviors become normalized, the standards used to evaluate them begin to shift, and what was once considered outside the norm becomes part of it, altering the boundaries that define what is expected and what is not. This shift in boundaries does not happen all at once, but through repeated exposure, through moments where the unusual becomes less surprising, where the unexpected becomes more predictable, and where the response to these events becomes more controlled, more contained, and less reflective of the initial reaction they once caused. As this continues, individuals may begin to adjust their expectations of the environment, no longer anticipating stability as a default, but instead preparing for variation, for unpredictability, and for outcomes that do not follow a consistent pattern. And this adjustment influences how they plan, how they act, and how they interpret what happens around them. There are also changes in how people communicate about these experiences, because when something becomes normalized, it is discussed differently, often with less emphasis, less detail, and less urgency, as if it no longer requires the same level of attention. And this shift in communication further reinforces the idea that these behaviors are part of the expected environment. In Gotham, this pattern can be seen in the way daily routines continue, even when conditions are complex, in the way individuals move through spaces that hold uncertainty, and in the way conversations reflect an understanding that certain events are not exceptions, but part of the ongoing rhythm of the city. This does not mean that people are unaffected, because the impact of these conditions remains, shaping thoughts, shaping emotions, and shaping behavior, but the outward response becomes more measured, more aligned with the need to maintain function rather than to fully process each event as it occurs. There is also a deeper layer to this process, one that involves perception, because as the boundaries of what is considered normal shift, the way people see the world changes as well, influencing how they interpret new situations, how they assess risk, and how they decide what requires attention and what does not. This change in perception can lead to a form of acceptance, not in the sense of approval, but in the sense of recognition, where individuals acknowledge that certain conditions exist and adjust their behavior accordingly, even if those conditions are not ideal. And this acceptance becomes part of the overall experience of living within the city. At the same time, there is a risk within this process, because as the unusual becomes familiar, the ability to recognize when something truly requires attention can become more difficult, as the line between routine and exception becomes less clear, and this can lead to situations where important signals are overlooked, where responses are delayed, and where the impact of events grows before it is fully addressed. This balance between adaptation and awareness becomes an ongoing challenge, because while normalization allows for continuity, it can also reduce sensitivity to change, making it harder to distinguish between what can be managed within routine and what requires a different response. For individuals, this creates a complex experience where they must navigate an environment that feels both familiar and uncertain at the same time, where routines provide structure, but conditions remain unpredictable, and where the sense of what is normal is constantly being shaped by ongoing events. Within the broader context of Gotham, this normalization contributes to the overall atmosphere, creating a sense that the city operates according to its own rhythm, one that includes both stability and disruption, both routine and variation, and where the two exist together rather than separately. This rhythm influences how individuals move through the city, how they interact with each other, and how they respond to challenges, creating patterns of behavior that reflect the conditions around them, and reinforcing the idea that adaptation is not only necessary, but expected. It also connects to the earlier patterns we have explored, showing how environmental influence, emotional response, and system structure all interact to shape experience creating a complex network where each part contributes to the whole, and where changes in one area affect others in subtle but important ways. As the journey continues, the normalization of extreme behavior becomes another piece of the larger picture, illustrating how the mind and environment adapt to each other over time, how expectations shift in response to repeated experience, and how the definition of what is ordinary can change depending on the conditions in which it exists. And so, within the ongoing movement of the city, where events unfold and routines continue, there is a quiet transformation taking place, one that does not demand attention, but shapes it, guiding how individuals see, respond, and understand the world around them, and reminding us that what feels normal is not fixed, but formed through experience, shaped by repetition, and influenced by the environment in ways that are both subtle and lasting. The endless cycle, as the quiet adjustment of what feels ordinary continues to shape daily life, another pattern begins to come into view, one that stretches across time rather than existing within a single moment. And in Gotham City, this pattern is not defined by one event or one outcome, but by repetition, by the way certain things return again and again, even after they seem to have ended, creating a sense that the city moves in cycles rather than in a straight line. There are moments when change appears possible, when efforts are made, when actions are taken, and when it seems that something different might take hold. And during these moments, there is often a sense of progress, a feeling that the direction of the city could shift, that the patterns that have existed for so long might begin to fade. Yet as time passes, these moments are often followed by a return, not always in the same form, but in a way that feels familiar, as if the underlying structure has remained the same. This pattern can be seen in the way individuals rise within the city, shaping events, influencing outcomes, and creating a presence that feels significant. And for a time, their actions may alter the environment, introducing new dynamics, new challenges, or new forms of response. Yet even when these individuals are no longer present in the same way, when their influence seems to have ended, something else emerges, something that fills the space, continuing the pattern in a different form. The idea that individuals can rise, fall, and rise again is not always literal, because it does not always refer to the same person returning, but rather to the continuation of roles, of patterns of behavior, of responses that follow similar paths, even when the individuals involved are different. And this creates a sense that the city itself maintains a certain rhythm, one that continues regardless of specific outcomes. There are times when efforts are made to interrupt this rhythm, when individuals or systems attempt to create lasting change, to break the cycle, to introduce something new that will hold over time. And these efforts can have real effects, altering the course of events for a period, creating space where different patterns can emerge, yet maintaining that change proves difficult because the conditions that supported the original cycle remain present. This difficulty does not mean that change is impossible, but that it is complex, because it requires more than a single action or a single intervention. It requires a shift in the underlying structure, in the patterns that have been built over time, and in a place where those patterns are deeply rooted. This kind of shift is not easily achieved. As a result, the city often appears to return to familiar states, not exactly the same as before, but close enough to feel connected, and this return can create a sense of inevitability, a feeling that no matter what actions are taken, the outcome will eventually align with the patterns that have existed for so long. This sense of repetition influences how individuals see their role within the city, because when patterns appear consistent, it can affect expectations, shaping the way people approach situations, guiding their decisions, and influencing how much they believe change is possible. For some, this may lead to persistence, a continued effort to create difference despite the challenges, a belief that each action contributes to a larger shift, even if that shift is not immediately visible. And this perspective allows for continued engagement, for ongoing attempts to influence the direction of the city. For others, the repeated nature of events may lead to a different response, one that is more cautious, more reserved, or more accepting of the patterns as they are. Because when change appears temporary, it can be difficult to maintain the same level of effort, especially when outcomes seem to return to familiar forms. This variation in response contributes to the overall dynamic of the city, creating a balance between those who push for change and those who adapt to existing conditions. And within this balance, the cycle continues, shaped by both action and acceptance, by both resistance and adjustment. There is also a deeper question that arises from this pattern, one that connects to the nature of the city itself. And that question is whether Gotham is unable to change, or whether the form of change it undergoes is simply different from what is expected. Because while certain patterns repeat, other elements do shift, new influences appear, and new dynamics emerge, even if they align with existing structures. This suggests that change in Gotham may not be about breaking cycles completely, but about moving within them, about altering details while maintaining the overall pattern, creating variation within repetition rather than complete transformation. And this idea challenges the expectation that change must be absolute to be meaningful. At the same time, the persistence of these cycles raises concerns about the long-term effects, because when patterns repeat, they reinforce themselves, becoming more established, more familiar, and more difficult to alter. And this reinforcement can make it harder for new approaches to take hold, as they must work against the weight of what has come before. This weight is not only external, but internal as well, because individuals who live within these cycles are influenced by them, shaping their expectations, their beliefs, and their responses. And as these internal patterns align with external ones, the cycle becomes more stable, more consistent, and more resistant to change. In this way, the city and its people become connected in a continuous loop where each influences the other, where patterns are both created and maintained through this interaction, and where breaking the cycle requires addressing both sides, the external structure and the internal response. There are moments when this loop becomes more visible, when events align in ways that clearly reflect past patterns, when outcomes resemble those that have come before, and when the sense of repetition becomes difficult to ignore. And in these moments, the question of change becomes more pressing, more immediate, and more complex. It is also in these moments that the idea of progress is challenged, because progress is often understood as movement away from past patterns. Yet, in Gotham, movement often occurs alongside repetition, creating a situation where progress and recurrence exist together, each influencing the other. This dual nature of movement creates a unique dynamic, where the city is both changing and remaining the same, where new elements are introduced but are shaped by existing patterns, and where the future is influenced not only by current actions, but by the history that continues to operate beneath the surface. As the journey continues, the presence of this endless cycle becomes a central part of understanding Gotham, because it shows how deeply patterns can be embedded, how they can persist despite effort, and how they can shape both environment and behavior over time. And so, within the steady movement of the city, where events unfold and responses take shape, the cycle continues, not as a fixed loop, but as a shifting pattern that adapts while remaining connected to its past, creating a sense of continuity that is both familiar and complex, and leaving open the question of whether it can ever be fully broken, or whether it will continue to evolve, carrying its patterns forward into whatever comes next. Reflection, monsters or mirrors? As the sense of repetition continues to unfold, carrying patterns from one moment into the next, a quieter question begins to rise beneath everything that has been observed. Not a question about what happens, but about why it happens. And in Gotham City, this question does not point toward a single answer, but instead opens into a deeper reflection about the people within the city, about who they are, about how they became what they are, and about whether the paths they follow are chosen, shaped, or revealed over time. When looking at the figures who move through Gotham, those who stand out, those who influence the direction of events, it can be easy to see them as separate, as different from others, as individuals who exist outside the usual patterns. Yet, as we look more closely, as we consider the influences that surround them, a different perspective begins to take shape, one that suggests their paths may not be as distant from others as they first appear. There is a question that lingers at the center of this reflection, a question that does not demand a simple answer, and that question is whether these individuals begin their lives already set on a certain path, already shaped in ways that lead them toward their actions, or whether the environment they move through gradually shapes them, guiding them step by step toward outcomes that might not have been clear at the beginning. For some, it may seem that certain traits are present early, that certain tendencies appear before the environment has had time to influence them fully. And this can suggest that there are parts of identity that exist independently, parts that guide behavior from within, shaping responses regardless of external conditions. At the same time, the influence of the environment cannot be ignored, because the patterns we have seen throughout Gotham show how strongly conditions can shape thought, shape emotion, and shape decision-making. And this suggests that even if certain traits exist, they do not operate in isolation, but interact with the world around them, creating outcomes that are the result of both internal and external forces. This interaction makes it difficult to separate cause and effect, because each part influences the other, creating a continuous process where identity is shaped over time, not fixed at the beginning, but evolving in response to experience. And in this way, the idea of being born broken becomes less clear, replaced by the idea of being shaped through a series of moments, each one contributing to the final form. Within this process, the boundary between different roles begins to blur, because the distinction between hero, villain, and victim is not always as clear as it first appears. And while these labels can help describe actions, they do not fully capture the complexity of the paths that lead to those actions. A person who acts to protect may carry experiences that resemble those who act in opposition, and someone who causes harm may have been shaped by conditions that place them in positions of vulnerability. And when these layers are considered together, the separation between these roles becomes less defined, creating a more complex understanding of identity. There are moments when individuals shift between these roles, not completely changing who they are, but responding to different situations in ways that reflect different parts of their experience. And these shifts show how flexible identity can be, how it can adapt to context, and how it can reflect both strength and vulnerability at the same time. This flexibility does not remove responsibility, because actions still have consequences, and choices still matter. Yet it adds depth to the understanding of those choices, showing that they are often shaped by a combination of factors, rather than by a single cause. And this understanding invites a more careful consideration of what leads to each outcome. In Gotham, where conditions are often intense, where patterns are deeply rooted, and where influence comes from many directions at once, the possibility that anyone could follow a similar path becomes more apparent, because the elements that shape these paths are not limited to a few individuals, but exist throughout the environment, affecting many in different ways. This does not mean that everyone will follow the same direction, because individual responses vary and each person interacts with their experiences differently. Yet the presence of shared conditions suggests that the potential for similar outcomes exists, depending on how those conditions are experienced and interpreted. There is a kind of quiet realization that comes with this perspective, one that shifts the way figures within the city are seen, moving away from simple labels and toward a more layered understanding, where each person is viewed as part of a larger system, influenced by it and influencing it in return. This realization can create a sense of connection, not in the sense of agreement with actions, but in the sense of understanding how those actions come to be, how they are shaped, and how they reflect broader patterns that exist within the city. And this understanding can change how the story is experienced, adding depth to each moment. At the same time, this perspective raises difficult questions. Because if the paths taken by these individuals are shaped by conditions that exist throughout the environment, then it becomes important to consider how those conditions might be changed, how the patterns might be altered, and how different outcomes might be supported. This brings the focus back to the relationship between the city and its people, because if the environment plays such a strong role in shaping identity, then changes within the environment could influence the direction of those identities, creating the possibility for different paths to emerge over time. Yet the presence of cycles, the repetition of patterns, and the persistence of certain conditions suggest that this process is not simple, that change requires more than intention, more than effort, but a shift in the underlying structure that supports these patterns. And this kind of shift is complex, requiring time, coordination, and a deep understanding of how each part interacts with the others. As the reflection continues, the idea of monsters and mirrors begins to take on new meaning, because what once seemed like a clear distinction between something separate and something reflective becomes less defined, revealing that these figures may be both at the same time, shaped by the city while also revealing it, influenced by its patterns while also expressing them in visible ways. This dual role adds another layer to the understanding of Gotham, showing how individuals can act as both outcomes and indicators, both participants in the system and reflections of it. And this understanding deepens the complexity of the city, making it not just a place where events happen, but a space where deeper patterns are revealed through those events. And so, as the journey moves closer to its final stages, this reflection remains, not offering a final answer, but opening a space for continued thought, inviting a deeper look at the connections that shape identity, at the forces that guide behavior, and at the possibility that within the patterns of Gotham, the line between what is created and what is revealed may never be fully separate, but always intertwined, always influencing each other in ways that continue to unfold. The quiet stillness beneath the chaos, as the long path of questions, patterns, and reflections begins to settle, there is a final shift in focus, one that moves away from constant motion and towards something quieter, something that has been present all along but has not always been noticed. And in Gotham City, this presence takes the form of stillness, not the absence of activity, but a deeper layer that exists beneath it, a calm that remains even when everything above it seems restless. It can be difficult at first to understand how stillness can exist in a place known for movement, for tension, and for unpredictability, because the surface of the city is filled with sound, filled with action, filled with moments that demand attention. Yet when the focus shifts, when the noise is allowed to fade just slightly, another layer becomes visible, one that does not compete with what is happening, but quietly exists alongside it. There are moments, often brief and easily overlooked, when the city feels different, when the pace slows just enough for something else to be felt, not seen in a clear way, but sensed, like a pause that exists between one event and the next. And in these moments, the tension that has been present begins to soften, not disappearing, but becoming less immediate, less demanding. This stillness is not created by the absence of events, because events continue, but by the way they are held within a larger space, a space that allows them to exist without defining everything. And within this space, there is room for reflection, for observation, for a different kind of understanding that does not rely on constant reaction. As the journey through Gotham comes closer to its end, this stillness offers a new perspective on everything that has been explored, because it shows that beneath the patterns, beneath the cycles, beneath the shifting forms of identity and behavior, there is something more stable, something that does not change as quickly, something that provides a kind of balance to the constant movement above it. This does not mean that the challenges of the city are removed, because they remain, shaping experience, influencing behavior, and creating the patterns that have been observed. Yet it suggests that these challenges exist within a larger context, one that is not entirely defined by them, one that allows for a different way of seeing what has been unfolding. There is a quiet sense that emerges in this space, a sense that not everything needs to be resolved immediately, that not every question requires a clear answer, and that some parts of the experience can simply be observed, allowed to exist without being fully understood. And this perspective creates a kind of calm that does not depend on conditions changing, but on how those conditions are viewed. In this calm, the earlier questions begin to take on a different tone, because instead of searching for a single explanation, they become part of a larger understanding, one that accepts complexity, one that allows for multiple influences to exist at the same time, and one that recognizes that not everything can be separated into clear categories. The idea that Gotham creates madness or reveals it begins to feel less like a choice between two options and more like a connection between them, because as we have seen, the environment shapes experience, yet individuals bring their own perspectives, their own responses, and their own interpretations, and these elements interact in ways that are continuous, not isolated. Perhaps the city does not create something entirely new, but instead provides the conditions where certain aspects of the mind become more visible, where thoughts and feelings that might remain quiet in other places find space to emerge, shaped by the environment, but also shaped by what already exists within the individual. This idea does not remove responsibility or reduce the impact of actions, because what people do still matters, and the effects of those actions remain real. Yet it adds depth to the understanding of how those actions come to be, showing that they are part of a larger process, one that involves both internal and external influences. Within this stillness, the patterns of the city can be seen more clearly, not because they have changed, but because the perspective has shifted, allowing them to be observed without the same level of urgency. And this observation reveals how each part connects to the others, how fear influences identity, how systems shape experience, how isolation affects perception, and how cycles continue over time. There is also a sense that this stillness exists not only in the city, but within the individuals who move through it, a space where thought can slow, where reflection can take place, and where the influence of the environment can be considered rather than simply reacted to. And this internal stillness offers the possibility of balance, even when external conditions remain complex. It is in this space that the idea of change takes on a different meaning, because change is no longer only about altering external conditions, but also about shifting perspective, about seeing patterns more clearly, about understanding the connections that shape experience, and about finding ways to respond that are informed by that understanding. This does not suggest that everything can be resolved through perspective alone, because the conditions of the city remain, yet it highlights the importance of awareness, of recognizing how influence works, and of using that recognition to guide response in ways that are thoughtful rather than automatic. As the final moments of this journey unfold, there is no need for a sudden conclusion or a definitive answer, because the nature of Gotham does not allow for simple endings, and the questions that have been explored do not close easily, instead remaining open, continuing to exist as part of the ongoing experience of the city. What remains is a sense of quiet understanding, a recognition that the city is not defined by a single idea, but by the interaction of many elements, each influencing the others, each contributing to the overall pattern, and that within this pattern there is both movement and stillness, both tension and calm, both complexity and clarity. And so, as everything begins to settle, as the layers of observation gently come to rest, there is space to simply remain, to let the thoughts drift without needing to follow them further, to allow the questions to exist without needing to answer them, and to recognize that within the quiet stillness beneath the chaos, there is a kind of balance, one that does not remove the challenges of the city, but places them within a wider view, where they can be seen, understood, and gently released into the distance. And now, as our quiet journey through Gotham City begins to settle, the noise we followed so closely starts to soften, not disappearing, but drifting farther away, like distant echoes moving gently through the night, no longer sharp, no longer demanding, just part of a story that has already been told. The questions we carried about fear, identity, and the fragile line between order and chaos begin to loosen their hold, becoming lighter, like thoughts that no longer need answers. Only space to rest, to fade, to simply exist without pressure. You may notice how the city feels different now, not louder, but quieter beneath everything, as if there has always been a calm waiting underneath the movement, a stillness that holds everything together without asking to be understood. And as your thoughts begin to slow, you can let Gotham drift gently into the distance, no longer something to solve, only something to remember, softly, quietly, without weight. Because in the end, perhaps the city does not change us. It only shows us what we carry, and then lets it go, until all that remains is stillness and rest.